Our next subject is going under the category of critical thinking, or, to shorten that, crit think. How's that working for you?
We could do crit IQ.
Crit
No, think
IQ?
is
No,
fine.
let's just crit think. It's short, it's to the point. The idea of this particular segment is to ask a question and then to do a little bit of brainstorming about it. So, on this particular crit think, I'm getting used to that one. We're going to be talking about dungeon crawls and the passage of time. Alex, I believe that the way you put the question to me was, how long were we in that cave for?
I mean, it doesn't have to be a cave to be a dungeon.
No.
Just a friendly note there.
Yeah.
But yeah, that came from the fact that a lot of times, not necessarily in the newer editions, but older editions of like 3.5, let's for instance, spellcasters to get their spells back, kind of have to take a long rest.
Sure.
So they're kind of useless if they expend all their spells in the first room of a dungeon. So it's like a lot of combats would go ahead with in combat heavy games, mind you. Kind of what would happen is, and this could have just been my experience with it from my groups I've been in, but I feel like just depending on your play style and your groups and whatever, this would be a thing. But it boiled down to, I'm out of spells. All right, well, are you useful other ways? Not really. All right, well, I guess we're gonna hunker down here in this dungeon room,
Right.
3 stories underground,
Yeah.
and just camp for 8 hours. It's like combat in D&D specifically is 6 seconds per round.
Sure.
So let's say you had a 10-round combat. That's a minute of combat, expending all your spells, especially at low levels. That's really easy to do. I know 5th edition made it a little bit harder to do that because you can get them back spells and stuff on short rests more often, and you also have the 0 level spells, which I believe are infinite cast. You can just cast them as many times as you want.
Cantrips.
Cantrips, yes. So there are also some attack spells that are cantrips that are decent. For instance, Eldritch Blast for warlocks is actually I believe, cantrip that is super OP. I love it, but the point is, in a lot of the older systems, it'd be, you have spells, now you need to go to sleep for 48 hours spending on your rest, your race.
Right.
So
just to kind of clarify, so you're thinking about the idea of how long we're in dungeons and figuring that out, mostly based on what the characters are able to do, in terms what their abilities are, essentially.
Yeah. So say you take a 10-round combat, a 1-minute combat, you waste all your spells, and you're like, all right, well, now we need to rest. We're injured. That was brutal. All right, now we need to heal and rest, and you've been in the dungeon for 30 minutes.
Yes.
All right. Yeah, we'll rest down here.
Mm-hmm.
Why? So it's like, all right, 30 minutes of exploring a dungeon, 1 combat down. Now you need to rest for 8 hours.
Yeah.
So the pace of going at that is a crawl. It's a literal dungeon crawl.
Right.
And I'm thinking, well, if you've only gone an hour's into the dungeon, for instance, first of all, an hour deep into a dungeon should be a fairly long distance unless it's a mega dungeon, like we mentioned before.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can go an hour into a cave, and you've gone a very long way.
Right.
Unless it's very narrow and it's very slow going, as per the crawl. But if you're only like 3 or 4 stories down, just leave the dungeon and go ahead and end for a night.
Yeah.
And then hit it again tomorrow.
Right. Because you're kind of exposed when you're actually in the dungeon, assuming
you're incredibly exposed.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm thinking about this now. So you assume that you're doing like a 1 hour of actual combat, which would be a long combat, true. Then you rest in for 8 hours. You figure that you're going to have to be in several of those while you're in the dungeon. By the time you leave that dungeon, you've been down there for, what, maybe close to a week.
Yeah, you spend days down there.
Yeah.
I know someone posted on Twitter a few days ago, I think. Something to do with make sure you have rations and water and stuff because you're going to be
Was just
down in
thinking.
that dungeon for a long time or something like that. I was like, well, here's the thing. It's like you shouldn't be in a dungeon for a week. That doesn't make sense. Who the hell is building dungeons that take a week to traverse? Aside from dwarves building undercities in the mountains.
That seems like a whole question in itself. Who's building dungeons in the first place?
That's another thing I've always often, not always, always
came-
often.
Yes.
Another thing I've often thought about is, have you ever seen the layout of dungeons? Like traditional D&D dungeons?
Who was constructing these?
Who is building these long, winding dungeon corridors that are like one hallway with nothing on the sides that goes down for a quarter mile, and then has like a room, and then kind of like goes around? It's like, these are cave systems. These
Oh,
are
yeah.
not dungeons. Who would build like this? Nobody.
Nobody. No, you would fire that engineer so
They would be
quickly.
dead faster than the termites got to them.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like I'm used to seeing some where it is caves and tunnel systems. Like I battled, there was an Ankeg queen, so there's these Ankegs. For those of you who don't know, think of like large bugs, essentially, is what they are.
For those of you who are watching the video portion, this Nathan has put a handy dandy picture right here.
I'll find a way to put a picture in there so you can see what
It'll
an
be
Ankeg
there.
looks like. It will be there. Don't worry. Sure, I'll remember. If I forget, I'm sure people will tell me. The point is, so basically, now it's a tunnel system. But even at that point, I started asking myself, like, how did they lay this out? Like, I started, like, I kind of understand the way it was laid out in that, there's little, like, cul-de-sacs that are out in the, so for, like, nurseries and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
I mean, if you've got a burrowing creature, then it might look like an ant farm,
Sure.
which has got the tunnel systems, and then again the cul-de-sacs where there would be like larvae or eggs or food supplies, and then it circle around and it's just a maze essentially.
Sure, yeah. But yeah, if you get into an actual dungeon or a sewers system or something like that, you don't expect there just to be passages to nowhere or just like
Yeah, no.
random place. And also, while we're at it, why are they putting down all of the traps?
Well, here's
know-
the thing. It's do they have a back way around this to get around the traps, or do
Right.
they have to go through their own traps?
Yeah, exactly. Wouldn't it be funny if you just were down in a dungeon and half the time you came across traps that obviously somebody had accidentally tripped and there were just dead people along the way of all of the traps that they accidentally set off?
That would be like going into a goblin hive and they set all these traps and forgot that the traps are there.
Yeah, exactly.
Where'd all these dead goblins come from? Well, they set all these traps and then they set all them off with their own bodies.
That's right. And so now we have no goblins left to fight. That would be interesting too. That kind of solves your problem of time. You don't have to get into any combat because your enemy was too stupid not to kill themselves off with their own traps. That's one way to solve it. So, when we're thinking about the passage of time, and it comes to dungeons, because I can see that you're under, from a completely logical standpoint, I can see where the idea, the very concept of time is going to start getting lost on you when you're down in a dungeon. There's no light, you can't see anything, so your circadian rhythm is completely off anyway. But in terms of like how long you're down there and keeping track of that, how might we actually do that? Like to make it so that players and their characters specifically can keep track of how long they are down there. Some of these people want their quests done in a timely fashion.
Alright, so first of all, there are some spells that some classes can use that can help them figure that out. I know druids specifically has a orison, a cantrip, that can kind of be like it'll tell you the weather.
Okay.
Like it's not useful in pretty much any other way, but it can tell you the weather and basically the time of day.
Got
So
it.
you cast that. It's a 0 spell. You can cast it whenever you want, but it'll be like, yeah, it's partially cloudy. It like has the way I imagine it is it comes up with like an orb of sunlight with clouds over it in your hand or whatever like that. You know, it shows you the depiction of the weather where you are.
Got it.
And so that, for instance, is super useful because then it's like, oh, it's nighttime. Let's go to bed. You
Right.
know? But then you'd still have to cast it to find out. Like you'd still need to wait to tell time. And
Sure.
hourglasses are a thing,
Yeah.
obviously. Hourglasses are not a thing that are probably reliable when you've got them in a backpack.
No. You have
Like,
to keep it
the-
handy.
Yeah.
So you can see it.
You could always use if clocks are a thing in the world that you're in. If they have any sort of watch, you could use that. It'd probably be gear powered. Some more steampunky games would probably have clockwork that works.
Sure.
You could always have other magical means of telling time.
Yeah. Yeah.
But let's say you've got a party of fighters. First of all, they don't need to rest as much because they don't have spells.
Right.
But, you know, let's say they don't get tired because their physical scores are great. So they're like, yeah, you don't get tired out as easily. You've been down there a couple hours.
Okay.
It's like, all right, now we're going to sleep. Well, how do you tell how long you sleep for? That's something. See, here's the thing. If you want to go with this and try to do that kind of thing, it's like, all right, you've lost all sense of time. You just slept for 16 hours.
Right. Right.
It's like, what?
Yeah.
You don't know how long it's been.
Exactly.
I know Vsauce on his minefield. He did that one where he was in a white room by himself, alone, with no way to tell time, no way to contact the outside world from there, and no other stimuli for like 3 days.
Okay.
And, you know, he talked about it afterwards. Like, there's nothing to do to occupy your mind in there. It's like he was doing physical exercises to try and pass the time, but there was no way to tell time, and you become incredibly disoriented.
Right.
Your sleep cycle is off. The amount of time you're sleeping is wacky.
Yeah.
Like, you're either sleeping very short amounts of time or sleeping lots of amount of times because you have no idea how much time has passed. So you would quickly become incredibly disoriented underground in a dungeon for days.
Yeah. I can totally understand that. Yeah. I'm trying to think about how you would be able to deal with that. I mean, I guess try to get out of it and go to a cave. Or go to an inn. And in the cave. They could put inns in the cave.
That'd be great. It's just a shopping mall. It's a dungeon, but it's a shopping mall. It's
the
the Quebec Underground.
Yeah, we could. That feels like, you know, sometimes when you're playing like roguelikes or the dungeon crawlers or something like that, and there are just those occasional levels where there's just a shopkeep there, and like, or a tavern or something when you go down into it. I think when I played like Undermine, there's places in the different levels where it's like, here's the shop, and you can enjoy the shop in the middle of the
we should delve into a little deeper into that sometime if we feel like it. Be like, what's like the lore, like reasoning behind a shop being 20 levels down in a dungeon?
Yeah, shops.
Who are they servicing? How do they get there? Where do they get their goods?
Yeah, exactly. How are you able to do that? And more importantly, who thought it was a good idea to set up shop in the dungeon? How many people do you think you're going to have for customers?
Well, apparently a lot.
Yeah. Is this really prime real estate? Yeah.
I assume that the way you get your items then is you stripping off the corpses of the people who've died.
Oh, product is not an issue. You can get plenty of product that way. It's just trying to think about, like, how many people do you think are going to be passing by your storefront if you're like, if it's Spelunky, and the dude just happens to have a little thing in the middle of Spelunky.
We need to actually just design our own dungeon now, but like your party is playing the shopkeepers in the middle, and you have to advertise to get other heroes to come in and then strip there.
Oh, that's excellent.
This will be a it won't be an RPG.
Yeah.
It'll be a card game or something. It'll be a board game.
Oh, very nice. Yeah, yeah,
Something
yeah.
like that. Yeah.
Oh, you know what you do? It could be a tile laying game. That would be
Yeah,
good
there
for
you go.
that. Yeah, and you have to keep expanding out the cave system, and then you have to determine where you want to put your resources for like advertising. and stuff.
Yeah, it'll be a reverse vast.
Yeah, it will be. You know,
Yeah.
it would be like Carcassonne, but instead of
okay.
putting your little meeples on it, it will be like you're getting ad space, and you have to get the most ad space for the different tunnel systems and things. Yeah, that would work out okay. But anyway, okay, so like when we started talking about like the idea of time in a dungeon, I guess the thing is I didn't think about it in the terms that you were normally thinking about it, which is like what are the characters going to be able to do? And I think one of the things that's interesting there is that time can also get a little conflated for the players just based on how much time you spend doing the combat and how much time you spend out of combat.
Yeah.
We've talked about it when we did Delve, but the idea of like one combat that might only be about 30 minutes in game can take you hours to go through, sometimes entire sessions, and then you can spend like maybe an hour describing what a 5-day trip from one place to another is in the overworld, and that's
Yeah,
true of the dungeons too.
Yeah, and the thing there is a half hour of actual combat time, like in-game combat time, would be epically long. I think I was talking to Crave the other day about how sword fights, typically like in movies and stuff, are really epic, and they take like a lot of parries and thrusts, and like they're these big graceful battles of these two people with excellent sword skill. But in reality, a sword fight to the death would be determined in a matter of blows.
Sure.
Like a samurai fighting another samurai is usually determined in a single stroke of the blade.
Yeah.
You know, it's not this epic swords clashing on each other's swords, hitting each other's armor, parries and thrusts, and no, it's brutal, incredibly violent, and it's like one person's bludgeoned to death.
Right. Right.
So, keeping that in mind, you know, in D&D, you know, combat takes forever. But
Sure.
the rounds are 6 seconds because combat is supposed to be fast. It's fast, it's visceral, you know, it's not this elegant thing that everyone kind of makes it out to be. The only way that is a thing is if you're doing like fencing,
Mm-hmm.
which is not a combat to death. It is a gentleman's sport of you know, back and forth. But even the rounds in fencing are fairly quick.
Yeah, absolutely. In terms of the differential between those as well, I will say that is something that video games did solve. Because when you're playing, like, let's say a Skyrim, for instance, the amount of time that you are in combat is still in relation to the game world. Everything's done in real time.
Yeah.
When you are moving along, you're also moving along at the same pace. And they also kind of solve one of the problems about figuring out how you do rests, because a lot of times they don't.
Yeah.
They just have potions or health items or something, or they have a magic system so that you have a pool, like a mana system.
Yeah.
And if they do rests, it's usually like, do you want to sleep in this bed for however many hours and just call it good? That, though, realistically, like you were saying, how do you know how long you slept for? Like,
Well, I think one of those things is usually in video games with the rest system is that you don't need to sleep, but in a lot of them, unless they're survival games, but they're like, yeah, you can get a bonus for sleeping though. You can get like a XP increase for whatever or whatnot.
right.
I think an interesting take on that would be is you don't need to sleep, but say your stamina starts regenerating slower if you don't sleep,
Yeah,
up to a point where it's just like your stamina just doesn't regenerate like
right.
at all. So it's like you have to sleep or else you are ineffective now because you're fucking tired.
Right. Yeah, no, I'm mostly thinking like, you can, the idea of taking a slider and saying, I want to sleep for this many hours.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, yeah, well, if you're all alone in most of these games, then I don't think that's going to necessarily work. You're probably going to have a little bit of an issue.
Yeah. What happens when you sleep in Fallout 4 for 17 years?
Yeah, nothing. Nothing really happens in the outside world. Not really, because it's kind of static, that particular game. When you get into those dungeons, in terms of both the player experience and for your PCs, how long do you think is a good length of time for your characters to be down there and for the players to actually be playing it while they're in there?
See, here's the thing, like, in game time, I would expect a dungeon to maybe take a player's, like, a day.
Sure.
Like, that's a decently sized dungeon. I'm assuming they're scouring everything.
Sure.
Like, you can go to abandoned places in the real world and explore the whole thing in a matter of hours.
Yeah.
And that's assuming you're looking through everything and you've got cameras and you're recording shit, because that's what you do when you explore abandoned places, I assume.
Fair.
You know, I would say a decently sized place you could explore the entire thing in a literal day, unless you're a mega dungeon.
Sure.
And that's the thing, is I feel like most dungeon crawls take multiple sessions.
Mm-hmm.
So they take multiple real world days to get through.
Sure.
But in game time, they're either taking exponentially longer than they need to, based on the actuality. Like, if you base it on reality,
Sure.
like, you're gonna be resting multiple times to do that. I feel like multiple sessions, you're gonna be resting multiple times. You can be like, yeah, this is just gonna take a single day in game, but we're gonna play it over 15 sessions. That would be, I don't even know. That would be a lot. It's like, yeah, this is still the same session you were in. It's like, what?
Yeah.
What? We're still playing the same one that we started on 15 sessions ago? People would be like, what are you talking about, man?
Yeah, yeah. And I think that that's where we get into some issues, because I'm going to start to get very bored of the setting and what we are doing in the game if I am still there 5 months later.
You're in the same room.
You're in the same room.
You're in the same room.
Yeah, exactly.
We haven't left this room yet? No.
Yeah. And similarly, like you were talking about with people saying you gotta bring rations and food and stuff, it's like, how long are you preparing to be down there? How many supplies do you need to bring with you?
Are we on an overland trek here, or are we in, like, one building?
Yeah, am I spelunking? Is that what we're doing right now? How... And, oh my goodness. Can you imagine if you had, like, a really evil GM? And what they did is they were like, yeah, okay, so here's something that you can give to your players next time. They go into the cave. They slide down into the cave. There's no way to get back out from the exit, from the entrance. So they got to find another way. So now there's no going back to taverns at the end of the day and calling it a day coming back later. They got to stay in there now. There's no way back up.
Welcome to your new home.
Welcome to your new home. It is the crypt. Enjoy. You're going to be here forever. Sorry.
And ever.
And ever. I mean, in terms of... I think what's really strange here is that for the amount of mechanics that you see in tabletop role-playing games, especially, there really isn't much to track time as a whole. Like, they figured out how to do it for rounds of combat, but you don't really see much in terms of the overarching passage of time and what to do with that. Like, for the most part, and this was always something that I wanted to see fleshed out more, is if my crew is down in that dungeon or the cave system, wherever, for a month, and they come back out, I would expect that the world has changed a bit from when they originally went down there. And maybe some people are a little upset that they've taken so long because the problem that they were trying to solve has exacerbated in the meantime.
Right.
Up above. And like, oh, you were trying to find the magical artifact down there so that we could depose the evil sorcerer from their throne. Well, it's been like 4 months now since you went down there to get that stone to take away the sorcerer's power, and the sorcerer has effectively turned half the population into kobolds. What are you gonna do about that? Why'd you take so long? Did we get lost along the way? Like, what happened? So I started thinking about that the passage of time, no matter where you are, whether you're in the caves, whether you're in the overland sections, should have some, correlation to the world around you. It shouldn't stay static like that. And
well, that's the thing, though. Generally, in an RPG setting, like in tabletop, or video games too, the passage of time doesn't typically actually dictate the passage of events happening, unless they're on a time limit.
Yeah.
Which doesn't happen nearly as often, I don't feel.
No.
Games like Majora's Mask, though, for instance, I believe was... No, it was the Ocarina.
No, it was not.
Majora's Mask was the moon, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I don't play Zelda games. I just know about it from hearing about it.
That's okay. I never actually played Majora's Mask, but I know about it.
The moon has like a 3-day cycle, and you have to do things, and it's timed.
Sure.
So that's a time limit. But in an RPG and a lot of other games, they don't typically count the passage of time based in actual time. It's the when you catalyze things, when you are the catalyst of the thing happening. So, for instance, in Lord of the Rings, Sauron was just doing his thing up until you catalyze that event.
Right.
Where it's like, oh yeah, now I've got the One Ring of Power, and it's like, guess I'll get off my fucking ass.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there was a status quo. The world just stayed a similar way, and then you came in. You were the Deus Ex Machina. You changed everything. And
like as you were saying,
yeah,
the sorcerer turned all these kobolds into statues or whatever.
Yeah,
it's like, you had 40 years. To fucking do this, guy.
Yeah.
What have you been doing for 40 years, sitting on your ass over there?
Yeah.
It took what, a single hobbit with a sword to get you off your fancy now? What are you doing?
Yeah,
it's like you are the laziest bad guy ever.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I see. So finally, we're like, all right. Well, I guess we finally got to get in gear. Yeah, I always thought that was kind of a weird, like, thing in fantasy in general, but I do see it so much in gaming that I wanted to see it fleshed out more. There was a game that I played. That was Outer Wilds, not Outer Worlds, but Outer Wilds. And that actually is also one where you're on like a 22-minute cycle, and you go through the world, and it's clockwork. It's a clockwork world, which we might talk about in more detail on some
I've
time.
heard a lot about that game as well.
Yeah, and Minute, which is also like a smaller one. It's like literally 1-minute rounds to get to places. But those are all time loop scenarios, where you start back at your beginning. It doesn't just keep going forward and events happen in time. There was a game from Spiderweb Software, Avernum, I want to say 3. Well, there was Exile 3, then Avernum 3, which was the remake they did. And that actually does have stuff where if you do not address certain situations in a timely fashion, you will see the consequences of you not doing something. And that's really turn-based more than anything, but there were towns that were being, like, attacked by slimes or other monsters, and if you do not solve the problem that they're having with that, slimes will start to wreck the town. They will eventually abandon some of their shops, because the slimes have completely taken over, to the point where basically the town isn't there at all. The shopkeepers are gone, the people are gone, and there's no coming back from that either. You've now completely abandoned them, you didn't do it in the time frame, and they do actually have, it takes you this long to go from this point to this point, and so think about your time constraints there, because it's going to matter. So they did do that. I would say that maybe like in a Stardew Valley too, you have different seasons, and so you have to know what you're going to be doing because it is a time management thing. But that's one of those where there's never really any long-term consequences to it.
Yeah.
You can kind of keep coming back to it. So
Yeah.
but in TTRPGs, I would have really liked to see a little bit more of that. Like, let's be realistic, folks. You know, yeah, you might be down there for a long time. You're in that mega dungeon for a year. But, you know, that doesn't mean that life doesn't keep going on up top.
You gotta remember, people don't want realism in their fantasy. Sometimes. Sometimes.
I think people want a measure of realism.
I
that
tend
keeps you
to try to
engaged.
make my worlds feel more dynamic when I have made them and when I run games. And so, yes, it's been a few years, but that's why the world isn't static from my games typically.
Mm-hmm.
Things that are there are typically location based rather than event based for the players doing a certain thing. If there's something in this area, it will be there until acted upon or until their stuff is going there. So when you accidentally summon fire elementals that are way above your character's party, power level to deal with, because it is something that would have been there no matter what level you were. It's like, well, the passage of time, these have been there. They're still kind of active, and you did something dumb.
Yeah,
That was pre-scripted.
sure.
So it makes the world feel more like it's got a life of its own as well.
Certainly. I also start worrying if you're down in the cave system long enough, a new generation of monsters will be born, grow up, and then be able to attack you while you're in the dungeon.
Yeah.
In the
What's the
meantime,
gestation period of those goblins again?
yeah. And when you're dealing with something like those insects, like the ant kegs, how long does it take from pupation to adulthood, where they can become warriors and workers? That's something to be considerate of. I would be very wary of that if you have the certain kind of person running your game that thinks about this stuff. It might matter. It might matter. Passage of time in video games, that's one of those things that's usually just built in because you can see day and night cycles a lot of the time. But in terms of when you get into TTRPGs, it's so much more abstract, it feels like, and should be more dynamic. I would like to see it more dynamic than that. Or possibly built into the system itself. That's the thing, though. I had one final question for you. Do you see a way that you could actually build a time system into an RPG?
I think that's a better question, not from me. I think that's a better question for anyone listening.
Yes, that is a good question.
For Discord and for Twitter and for anyone who's listening on whatever platform, for voice clips, if you want to send those in with your thoughts.
Absolutely. So I guess what we'll do to just kind of end this is we're going to send the Crit Think off to all of you. How would you build a time system into an RPG? Let us know.
I think that's the best way to end the Crit Think section, is a question for people to answer on their own.
That's right.
Hopefully interactively with us, though. I think that's a good way to do that section.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, you can keep it
Great
to
idea.
yourself. We'd like to know, though.
Yeah,
If you
share.
could.
Sharing is caring. Show us that you care.
Exactly. And then we can all have a Crit Think together.